Hi, this is Michelle Goodwin with the Claremont Law Journal, and sitting with me is Professor Jerry Cohen at NYU. He is the foremost authority on Chinese and international law, specifically in relation to Taiwan. In fact, recently he was received by the President of Taiwan. So it's our pleasure to interview him today in relation to human rights and international law in relation to China specifically. So our first section is going to be on the rule of law in China and human rights in China. So quickly, in background with Professor Jerry Cohen, he had a previous interview with a board of other authorities on China, and he talked a lot about how the Chinese rule of law needs to change from the top down instead of the bottom coming and trying to upseat the top. So I just wanted to ask his opinion a little bit about what could incentivize a top leader to change, and what kinds of rules of law would be affected if the top decided to do that.
Well, this is a very current problem. On January 7th, just 5 days ago, the leading figure in China, the new all-powerful Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Communist Party, President of the government of China, head of the military commission, has just made a speech. It's one of a number he's made in the past year, urging court reform, urging progress toward the rule of law, urging the Communist Party that he controls to exercise more restraint and try not to directly influence the outcome of cases that are before the courts. Now, he's not doing this out of the love of humanity or human rights concerns. He's doing this because increasingly the people of China are demanding better justice. There has been a spate of revelations about unfair convictions, wrongful judgments, some of which have condemned people to very, very serious punishment. And that has led more than ever the people of China to distrust their courts. The courts have a poor reputation for many well-earned reasons. And the populace is demanding it. And Mr. Xi, the boss now, on the one hand, is more repressive than his predecessor, Hu Jintao. They are tightening up freedom of speech so that there is almost no freedom of expression now in China. But that comes at a cost. And he's trying to, as it were, make it up to people by assuring them that he will attend to the administration of justice, introduce fairness, and will gain popularity for the party and himself, and credibility for the courts. So the populace is doing what it can to make its demands. The media, to the extent it's allowed to report, is revealing abuses in the courts. The legislature is improving the relevant laws for both criminal justice and civil justice. But what has to be improved is the administration, the application of the law in practice, not theory, not just have a better piece of paper, but actually make that paper part of the living law that will protect people's rights and make them feel better about the Communist Party and their government.
So then you talked a little bit about how the new boss is using the reform of the courts to curry favor. Is that the only reason? Is there another way to create this top-down change other than for political purposes? Is there another way to incentivize it, do you think?
Well, the incentive he has is to be known as a leader who believes in better government and assuring justice, fairness, the opportunity to be heard by judges who are impartial is a very important ingredient of the political reform that he is promising the people. So he has a maximum incentive, and he's taking to himself political power that was previously dispersed among other party leaders. And he's doing that because he's in a power struggle and he wants to win. And by taking control of the police and the Justice Department and the prosecutor's office and the courts and the prisons, he will have the levers of power that in the previous administration, the chairman of the country, the president, head of the party, didn't have. They left it to another person in the standing committee of the Politburo that governs the country. And they regretted it because that person didn't always act in ways that the other party leaders liked. And indeed, we're waiting here just this week to see whether there will be news that that person named Jo Young Kang will be criminally investigated and perhaps prosecuted for abuse of his power as the head of the political legal system of the country for the 5 years preceding the advent of the current administration, which began a year ago. So this is a power struggle that's in the background, as well as a desire to make the courts credible, stop the raft of petitions. Chinese people are ferocious petitioners. And if justice is closed to them, if the courts won't take their cases or they give abusive decisions, Chinese people will go all the way to the capital in Beijing and protest. And tens of thousands have done that, creating political consternation. And a lot of them are locked up illegally in what are known as black jails. Not authorized jails, but police-imposed jails that are highly irregular and are big infringement on freedom. But the party is desperate to stop the flood of petitions. And one way is to provide more justice, and that will lead to fewer petitions.
That's true. And another way to kind of create change would be through news and the freedom of speech, which you spoke a little bit about earlier, and how that's kind of being stomped out.
If the party were willing to allow freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, if it were willing to allow a free media, that would alleviate a lot of grievance, but it would create what the party fears would be a lot of political instability and maybe huge criticism that they don't have the confidence to believe they can withstand. In 1957, Chairman Mao Zedong thought that it would be good for the Communist Party to have people speak out. Let 100 flowers bloom. And people did speak out, thousands of them, in a flood of criticism that the party didn't expect and couldn't tolerate. And that led to the end of the 100 flowers bloom period and to a crackdown, a harsh political movement where hundreds of thousands of people were arbitrarily detained by the police and sent to labor camp. That movement was known as the anti-rightist movement because the critics were identified as rightist, unfair critics of the Communist Party. And reverberations of those sanctions that were imposed are with us to this day.
And which freedom would you say is the most important for the people and possibly even the most detrimental to the party?
Well, right now the struggle has come to focus on the internet and social media.
Yes.
They were not available in 1957, 58, and they have become powerful instruments that the party is desperately trying to control. They do not want people to be able to denounce them without approval of party officials. And they are fighting rather more successfully than many people anticipated to keep the lid on adverse opinions. People have said very often, rather airily, we're confident that the internet will defeat any dictatorship. But China is the real test. And so far, the dictators are doing pretty well. adverse material that appears on the internet may only be there half an hour, maybe an hour, certainly not more than a day. And not only are they suppressing opinions they don't like, they're putting their own opinions, often paying people to say positive things as an antidote to the negative things other people are saying. So this is a fierce political struggle over control of the internet and social media.
Social media has come to be a huge point in not only all our lives here in the US, but all over the world. And so China's lack of support would garner some sort of criticism internationally. Has there been any sort of big outrage by the UN or anything along those lines?
Well, China takes a lot of criticism from human rights organizations in this country and in Europe and in Taiwan and even in Hong Kong, which is part of the People's Republic now, but has a somewhat separate administration. There is, of course, before the UN's various committees, enormous amount of criticism of China, and UN organizations put more heat on the Chinese government. And that's another pressure that they're feeling to try to demonstrate that the courts can be improved. China wants the world's good opinion. They want to be known as exponents of soft power. They want the so-called socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics to have the respect of the world community. But that's easier said than done. And when it comes to a clash between that value and the value in repressing critics who might shake the stability of the regime, the leadership, although they'd love to have better world opinion, always has to choose its own security. The prime objective of the government is to enhance its control of the people. And everything has to be seen according to the current party line in terms of its potential for maintaining stability. Stability maintenance is the cry, and courts will continue to keep that in mind, even if they improve as the party leadership wants them to. The leadership wants to make sure that local influences will not adversely influence a court decision. Those local influences are many: corruption, local protectionism, guanxi, relationships that people have with judges that may be more important than any law in terms of the actual handling of a case. You have questions of some judges aren't as competent as they should be. There are many distorting influences on a fair court decision. The leadership wants to improve that situation, but they're not going to give up their ability to control the courts with respect to other matters. And the judges must always keep in mind, what is public opinion calling for? In a curious way, this is a kind of democracy. It's the rabble, if you will, or the masses, often shouting for justice, sometimes rightly and sometimes wrongly. And the courts are told that they must always listen to the opinions of the masses, because otherwise their judgments might lead to political instability. So you have this curious situation. Judges are supposed to be mindful of the law, they're supposed to be impartial, they're supposed to disregard all kinds of adverse influences, but on the other hand, they're told they must always keep in mind public opinion. And recently, the leadership resurrected the slogans of the previous administration of Hu Jintao, which told the courts there are the three so-called supremes they must keep in mind. The first is the will of the party. The second is the wishes of the people. And the third, a poor third, the law and the Constitution.
Wow.
So that's what judges will have to continue to keep in mind, even under the reforms that are now being debated and implemented.
And where does the most powerful reform hit? Is it in the appellate court? Is it in the Constitution itself? Or is it in just the actual criminal courts or civil courts or things along those lines they have in China?
Well, the proof is in the pudding. There are many improvements in the new criminal procedure law that went into effect on January 1st of 2013. Some of those improvements, like making it somewhat easier for a defense lawyer to gain access to a detained client in prison, in jail, are being implemented. This new law is making some improvements, but in other respects, it's not happening because the police don't want it to happen. It's one thing for the police to say, okay, we'll let the defense lawyer go to the detention house and meet for an hour with the detained person, which they've often discouraged. But it's another thing for the police themselves to be ordered to go to court and be cross-examined in court about whether they actually tortured a criminal suspect or not. Police are not happy in any country about being taken to court and cross-examined. I used to be a federal prosecutor. I know what they've been through and the kinds of things that can happen. But in China, in over 95% of the criminal cases, no witnesses appear in court. Only thing that usually appears in court besides the defendant, and you have a prosecutor, you have some judges, but witnesses generally do not appear in court. So you can't cross-examine them if they're not there. What the prosecutor does is simply read out in court their pre-trial testimony that's been taken from them. It's a piece of paper. You can't cross-examine a piece of paper. The recent famous trial of the fallen political leader Bo Xilai was distinctive in one respect. He was allowed to cross-examine witnesses who were allowed to come to court because the people of the country were watching and the administration wanted to put on a good show trial to show they were treating him fairly, even if they weren't. But normally, witnesses don't come to court, and police certainly don't come to court. But the new criminal procedure law requires that if the defendant makes a plausible showing that he might well have been tortured into making a confession, police are supposed to come to court to repudiate that and run the risk of cross-examination. So this hasn't happened yet. So you have a situation in China of great repression of opinion and expression, improving legislation, but only a so-so picture of implementing that legislation. So what has to happen in order to bring the kind of justice the public demands and the leadership would like the public to believe exists is better implementation. And that's going to require very, very serious party efforts. China is a huge country. It has a huge population. Traditionally, the Chinese have a saying, heaven is high and the emperor is far away. Meaning if you don't live in the capital, you can get away with a lot that the central government won't like. And that's still the situation, despite the improvement in communications, education, etc. So the real challenge for the central authorities, starting with Xi Jinping, the great leader, who's going to be all-powerful, more powerful than anybody in China has been since the demise of Deng Xiaoping. The real challenge is how to get the cities, the counties, the provinces that are so far away to do what the new leadership wants. And that's not easy.
It doesn't sound very
It's
easy.
an enormous challenge because although China is a communist country built on revolution, etc., it's actually now a very conservative place. It's become so successful. So many people have become rich. You have so many vested interests in all these localities. They don't want change. They fear change. And yet the masses of people who have not yet benefited from this fabulous national economic development, they want change. They want fairness. They want justice. So China is in turmoil now. The world fears China, but the world doesn't know what the Chinese leaders know. That internally in China, you have a serious ongoing struggle every day.
I believe in an article you wrote, you called China a cat on a hot tin roof.
Well, that's right. Often when you think of what the leaders of China have accomplished in overall economic development and social progress, it seems cruel that they should face the kind of threat and dilemma they obviously fear. They fear they can be easily overthrown. June 4th, 1989, the tragedy in which hundreds and hundreds of people were killed in Beijing and some elsewhere, proved to them how close it can be. Previous governments in China were overthrown by crowds. That's how the revolution of 1911 overthrew the Manchu Qing dynasty. And that was not the only time that has happened. So you have a leadership that's running scared, and you have a leadership that now has been exposed as being divided. They try for many years to present a facade of unity to the people. But now the fierce internal debates, the rivalries, the factions that inevitably exist have come into public view, and some of their dirty laundry has been really washed in the trial of Bo Xilai, the previous trial of his wife on murder charges. Can you imagine husband and wife separately sentenced to life imprisonment? And at the root of it is Bo Xilai's ambition. He wanted to be number one in China. He didn't want Xi Jinping. And now we're all awaiting to see whether his closest supporter in the previous Politburo Standing Committee, Zhou Yongkang, the man I mentioned earlier, who was in charge of the police, the courts, the prosecution, the really internal security, they were afraid that he could have taken them over. So now this is all coming out in public, and it's destroyed the facade of unity that the leadership likes to present. Politics is fierce in China, and they play for keeps.
It's true. And just how long do you think it will be until there is the court reform, or at least some stability in that government?
It's very hard to say. There are certain reforms taking place, as I indicated. Stability, that's another question. This whole question of what is political stability. Dictatorial regimes, not only communists, but right-wing regimes such as Taiwan had under Chiang Kai-shek, or South Korea had under Park Chung-hee and others, they also claimed they had to repress people to assure political stability, but that stability was always very short run. Real stability comes from creating political institutions that allow people to process their demands and grievances, and to create a little bit of superficial instability in doing so, public debate, disagreement. But that creates long-term stability. That's the challenge now confronting China's leadership. They talk about political reform, but in addition to opening the courts and improving judicial conduct, are they going to provide outlets for people to express themselves instead of this very rigid repression that they now have?
And that's the question that will plague us forever until we know for sure. So thank you so much, Professor, and we have more on this interview a little bit later.
Good.